There is a particular kind of silence that often follows a betrayal you never saw coming. It is not the explosive silence of sudden shock. It is a sinking silence. Slow, like dust settling over an abandoned structure. My son chose a woman over his own father, and she made sure that choice became absolute. Everything collapsed on an afternoon in March 2022. A phone call I will never forget. The voice of Nathan, my son, trembling yet distant. He said Brianna felt that I was interfering too deeply in their lives. Too involved. That was the phrase she had planted in his mind. Nathan asked me to limit contact. He wanted me to step back. In truth, he was telling me to disappear from his life. That was the moment I realized the family structure I had spent decades building had been infiltrated. The pain did not feel like a wound. It felt like noticing that the foundation of your house is beginning to sink, and you know that if you do not act, the entire building will eventually collapse. My name is Walter, a retired construction engineer in Knoxville. For 31 years I learned how to read blueprints. I understand that the strength of a building is never in the shiny paint on the outside. It lies in the steel bars quietly carrying the load inside the concrete. My father Raymond Stokes taught me that. He used to say the only asset worth owning is the kind that does not disappear when the world turns its back on you. I have lived my entire life by that philosophy. Calm, quiet, always prepared for the structural cracks that others ignore. But I failed to see the crack inside my own family. Not until Brianna arrived. The first time she stepped into this house, she did not look at the family photographs. She did not notice the warmth of the fireplace. She looked at the oak floor. She studied the walnut furniture. That look was not admiration. It was an inventory. She was calculating the value of everything like a professional property appraiser. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Before we go any further, leave a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. And I would really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means a great deal to us. The humiliation was absolute. But Brianna and Nathan forgot one important thing. I am an engineer. And an engineer never panics when he sees a crack. We study it. We analyze the load. And then we reinforce the entire structure in a way that no one will ever break again. That phone call was not the end. It was the beginning of a new blueprint, one that Brianna would never see until it was far too late. The next morning I woke up in a house so quiet I could hear the wood contracting in the walls. The anger from the night before had cooled. It had hardened into something thick and cold, like cement beginning to set. I made a pot of tea and sat down at the dining table. In front of me was not a normal breakfast. It was a blank sheet of paper and a mechanical pencil. In construction, we call this the moment of regaining control. When a steel beam twists under excessive load, you do not stand there shouting at it. You step back. You take inventory of the situation. You evaluate the supports that are still standing. Nathan believed pushing me away would give him freedom. Brianna believed she had removed the final barrier between herself and what she wanted. They were both wrong. They had made the most basic mistake of an amateur builder. They underestimated the foundation. I picked up the phone. The first person I called was not my son to beg for an explanation. I called Miriam Cho. Miriam is not only one of the top asset lawyers in the region, she is also the daughter of an old friend. She understands that in this world the best protection is not high walls. It is legal language that cannot be penetrated. I told her I wanted to restructure all of my assets immediately. Everything needed to be sealed and protected. That morning I drove my old truck, which had already served me for 11 years, to her office. Brianna always curled her lip whenever she saw that truck. She called it a piece of scrap metal that embarrassed the neighborhood. She never understood. That truck is proof of patience. Every dollar I refused to spend on a luxury car became another brick in the quiet structure of my wealth. Miriam studied the numbers in my files. She looked up at me in disbelief. "Walter, how did you do this?" I gave her a bitter smile. "Slowly and boringly, Miriam. That is how I built it. For decades I packed my own lunch for work. I repaired my own plumbing. I invested in low-risk index funds and left them alone. $4.2 million did not fall from the sky. It is the result of thousands of disciplined days. My goal is not to punish Nathan. I love my son, but I have come to a painful realization. The Nathan I see now is not the one in control. He is just a structural element being damaged by outside pressure. Brianna believes she is playing a simple game of taking what she wants. She does not realize she has stepped onto a construction site where I hold the original blueprint. I sat across from Miriam as we began drawing the boundaries. Irrevocable trusts, limited liability companies to protect capital. I was building a legal fortress around my life, a fortress Brianna could see but never enter. She wanted me to limit contact. I would give her complete silence, but it would be the kind of silence she would regret for the rest of her life. An engineer always knows when to reinforce a structure and when to step back and let a flawed one collapse under the weight of its own design. Miriam's office sat on the top floor of a glass tower. From there I could see the entire city of Knoxville shifting and growing, but my mind was not on the skyline. My attention was fixed on the thick folders spread across the desk. Numbers never lie. They are the most precise language I have ever known. More precise than the promises my son made on his wedding day. I began explaining my intentions to Miriam. I wanted to establish a trust and a limited liability company. In engineering, we call this load separation. When one section of a structure fails, you must ensure it does not bring down the entire system. I wanted the $4.2 million to become an isolated island. Brianna could marry Nathan. She could live beside him. But she would never touch what belonged to the Stokes family. Miriam adjusted her glasses and studied me carefully. Are you certain about this, Walter? This means even Nathan would not be able to withdraw money without the approval of the trust board. I nodded without hesitation. That is correct. I am not protecting the money from my son. I am protecting my son from people who want to use him. Brianna had entered Nathan's life with a financial blueprint already drawn in her mind. I was simply changing the combination on the safe. The legal clauses began to take shape. They were sharp and precise, like laser cuts across steel. Separate assets, no shared access, no immediate inheritance rights in the event of divorce. Miriam paused and gave a small, knowing smile. Walter, whoever ends up on the other side of this plan one day is not going to have a pleasant experience. I looked out the window as clouds slowly gathered over the city. That is exactly the goal, I replied. Have you ever had to protect the work of your entire life from your own family? Watch carefully how I did it. If you ever find yourself in that position, it might help you too. After signing the stack of documents, I returned to the quiet house. Time began to move in a strange way. From 2023 to 2025, I lived like a ghost in my own son's life. Brianna had succeeded in building a wall between us, but she did not realize that I had built a wall of my own. Every year I sent 3 cards. One for Nathan's birthday, one for Thanksgiving, and one for Christmas. I did not call. I did not beg for attention. I wrote only one sentence each time. Your father is still here. Nothing will ever change that. It was not weakness. It was the patience of an engineer. I was waiting for the structure to reveal its own weaknesses. I spent that time tending the garden and maintaining the house. I polished my mechanical tools until they shone. I cooked my father's beef stew recipe for myself, letting the smell of onions and black pepper fill the kitchen. In those moments, I felt connected to the past, to the integrity my father had passed down to me. From a distance, through the few sources of information that reached me, I watched what was happening. I saw Brianna begin buying luxury items, the expensive car she drove, the long vacations I only glimpsed through social media, the parties that seemed to happen again and again. It became clear they were living a life far beyond Nathan's real means. Whenever I happened to see my son out on the street, his eyes would always look away. I knew that was not the man he truly was. I had walked beside him since the day he was born. I understood his nature better than anyone. What I could not understand was how his wife had managed to manipulate him so completely. But the control was almost absolute. She believed that all my assets would naturally pass to my son one day. She assumed the Stokes family safe would soon open. Half of the wealth my wife and I had built over more than 30 years would be divided. For 3 years I knew she had been executing a careful plan, one she believed would surely defeat a lonely old man like me. But she was building a castle on sand. And I was the only person who knew the tide was rising. In construction, we have a golden rule. An error of 1 inch in the foundation becomes a yard of error at the roof. Brianna made that mistake from the very beginning. Now all I had to do was sit and let gravity finish the rest of the work. I waited for the day the illusion would break. The day my son would realize he had been nothing more than a possession, or more accurately, a piece on his wife's chessboard. I often imagined the moment, the phone ringing, Nathan's name on the screen, his voice no longer confident, tired, broken. He would say that Brianna had filed for divorce. She would not simply want to leave. She would demand half the house, half the savings, and half of what she believed was Nathan's future inheritance. Her lawyer would make the first move, and I would open a thick 50-page folder, the documents describing the trust and the limited liability company we had established back in 2023. The documents that would force Brianna to realize she had miscalculated a massive variable. She had spent 3 years planning to seize a fortress whose entrance had been sealed on the very first day. Now I need to pause for a moment because I want to check in with all of you. If you are feeling very sleepy, do not comment the number 1 right now because it might wake you up. If this is the moment when you are most alert and do not want to miss any part of the story, comment the number 2. Either way, anyone who comments 1 or 2 is clearly awake enough to keep listening. For 3 years I imagined the outcome happening quickly and decisively. Brianna leaving with far less than she had dreamed of, unable to claim what had never belonged to Nathan in the first place, like someone trying to tear down a load-bearing wall with a toy hammer. My revenge was never insults. It was never loud arguments. My revenge was the truth that I had prepared while they believed I was collapsing. I protected my father's legacy with the cold legal instruments Brianna had always desired. The structure still stood, and now it was time to see whether what remained could be repaired. After a storm, a house must always be inspected for damage before the rebuilding begins. The years from 2023 to 2025 became a test of structural endurance. In construction, we use sensors to measure the movement of concrete blocks. The changes are slow, almost invisible to the eye, yet the pressure is always there. That is how I lived during those years. With absolute discipline, I watched Nathan sink deeper into that toxic marriage the way an engineer watches a bridge bend under excessive load. It hurt to see, but I could not allow myself to interfere with emotional impulses. Every year, I followed the same ritual. 3 moments, 3 cards. My son's birthday, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. I would sit at the wooden desk in my study and write the same sentence. Your father is still here. Nothing will ever change that. I never wrote about how much I missed him. I never wrote about the betrayal. I simply affirmed my existence. A fixed reference point, like a survey marker on a construction site. No matter how much the ground shifts, that marker must remain still. Brianna did everything she could to erase my presence. She blocked my phone number. She deleted messages. But she could not block handwritten letters sent through the mail. To her, they were trash. She could throw them into the fireplace if she wanted. But Nathan would see them first. He would know that somewhere in Knoxville the old foundation had never moved. During those years I trained my patience. I polished my calipers and mechanical tools. I reorganized the archives of my past construction projects. I lived on the simplest possible budget. Brianna saw that modest life from a distance and assumed I was running out of money. She believed my silence meant confusion and defeat. That was her fatal mistake. She confused silence with absence. Some nights I would sit on the porch and look toward the distant lights of the city. I wondered whether I was being too harsh, whether I should break my own rules and go to Nathan's house and pull him out of that situation. But then I would remember my father's words. Raymond Stokes once told me something I never forgot. Walter, you cannot save a structure that wants to collapse. All you can do is prepare the materials so you can rebuild after it falls. I accepted that pain. It was a slow, steady ache. I learned to observe the warning signs from afar. Through a few mutual friends, I heard that Brianna had begun pressuring Nathan into taking loans to maintain their glamorous lifestyle. I heard that cracks were beginning to appear in the alliance between them. Greed never stops growing, and when it cannot find new fuel, it begins to consume its own host. So I continued waiting, the same way an engineer waits for concrete to cure before removing the formwork. 36 months, 1,095 days, 9 cards. Each card was another brick strengthening my resolve. I was waiting for the first sound of collapse. Not because I wished for disaster, but because I knew it was the only way Nathan would finally wake up. An engineer is not afraid of a collapse. The only thing we fear is not having a plan for rebuilding afterward. And my plan had been finished down to the final detail. The storm finally arrived in early 2025. It did not begin with thunder. It began with the relentless ringing of my phone. The call came from attorney Harrison Cole. Brianna had officially filed for divorce. She did not just want freedom. She wanted a full liquidation of assets. In her world, every relationship had a price. And she believed she had calculated the value of the Stokes family correctly. I sat in Miriam Cho's office. Harrison Cole sat across the table in an expensive suit. He opened his folder with the confidence of a man who believed he had found a weakness in a steel structure. Then he began listing the assets. The house in Knoxville, the savings accounts, and most importantly, Nathan's future inheritance. He described it as potential shared marital property. He even spoke about Brianna's supposed contribution to maintaining the family image. I watched him carefully. I did not see a lawyer. I saw a demolition worker trying to knock down a load-bearing wall without knowing what was inside it. He stated that his client deserved $2 million to sign a peaceful settlement agreement. Otherwise, they would take the case to court and drag the Stokes name through the mud. He believed the threat would shake me. He assumed a retired old man would be intimidated by polished legal language. But he forgot something important. I had spent 31 years dealing with real pressure. The pressure of thousands of tons of concrete. The pressure of errors that could cost lives. His arrogance was only artificial weight. It carried no real load. So I let him finish speaking. I wrote down every demand carefully. My silence only made him more confident. He believed I was calculating how much money I would have to pay. When he finally stopped talking, I slowly looked up. I met Harrison Cole's eyes and spoke calmly. Mr. Cole, I have designed bridges that can withstand Category 12 storms. And I can assure you of one thing. The structure you are trying to attack does not exist. Miriam Cho gently pushed a thin folder across the table toward him. Only 5 pages. But the most important 5 pages in the room. They were the documents proving that every asset had been transferred into an irrevocable trust 3 years earlier. The house did not belong to me. The accounts did not belong to Nathan. They belonged to an entity beyond the reach of marital law. Harrison Cole's face shifted from red to gray. He flipped through the pages frantically, searching for a loophole, a tiny flaw in the language, a technical error. But Miriam and I had reviewed that blueprint hundreds of times. There were no cracks in it. Brianna sat beside him. The sharp confidence in her eyes slowly collapsed into shock. In that moment, she realized she had spent 3 years planning to seize a fortress that had been sealed from the inside on the very first day. Their arrogance crumbled right there in the room, like a building with no foundation facing a real earthquake. The conference room fell into a suffocating silence. Not the calm kind of silence, the kind that comes just before a steel structure tears apart under unbearable pressure. Harrison Cole stared at the legal file as if it were a black hole. He flipped through the pages so violently that he tore the edge of the folder. Brianna sat frozen beside him. Her face had turned pale. The sharp confidence she usually carried was gone. In its place was pure panic. Harrison finally looked up. His voice no longer carried the polished tone of a successful lawyer. It was rough and strained. "Why did you do this?" he asked. "Why prepare something this thorough 3 years in advance?" I felt no triumph, only a cold sense of relief. "Mr. Cole," I said calmly, "I worked as a construction engineer for 31 years. The most important lesson I learned is this. Assumptions about what a structure contains can never replace actually reading the blueprints. They had assumed I was a weak old man. They had assumed Nathan was the door to the treasure vault." Brianna began to tremble. She said it was unfair. She said she had spent the best years of her life with Nathan. She said she had taken care of this house. I interrupted her firmly. "You did not take care of this house. You audited it. You did not love Nathan. You invested in him like a business transaction. And in business, when you fail to study your partner properly, you lose. That is the rule." The $4.2 million was still there, untouched, impossible to reach. In that moment, Brianna realized she had not only lost the money, she had lost the power she believed she controlled. She had spent 3 years building a castle on land she never owned. "Do you believe that preparation and truth always defeat greed?" If this turning point satisfied you, press the like button right now. Miriam Cho closed the file. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. Mr. Cole, she said, if you wish to continue this case, we are ready. But remember this. Every dollar you spend on legal fees will only increase your own client's losses. This trust includes a protective clause against frivolous claims. Harrison Cole looked at Brianna and slowly shook his head. He knew the battle had ended before it even began. Brianna burst into tears. But they were tears of frustrated rage, not remorse. She stood up and walked out of the room without looking back at Nathan even once. She was finished with us now that there was nothing left to exploit. I remained seated for a moment and looked at my son. Nathan sat there with his head lowered. He had just witnessed the collapse of the woman he once loved, and he had also witnessed the strength of the father he had pushed away. I said nothing. I simply stood up and placed my hand on his shoulder. My hand was rough but steady. An engineer does not only know how to dismantle broken structures, we also know how to stand beside what remains and begin the process of rebuilding. The greatest revenge is not taking someone's money. The greatest revenge is showing them that they never had the power to break your integrity. The foundation had been cleared. Now we could finally begin to build again. After the legal storm passed, silence returned to Knoxville. But this time it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of humiliation, the silence of understanding. One October afternoon, when the dry, golden sunlight spilled across the porch, Nathan appeared. He was not driving the luxury car Brianna had once forced him to buy. He had walked. His figure looked thinner, almost broken. He stood at the front door but did not dare to knock. I watched him through the curtain. An engineer always knows when a material has reached its load limit. Nathan had reached that point. I opened the door. There were no raised voices, no accusations. I simply stepped aside and let him come in. In the kitchen, the pot of beef stew filled the air with its rich aroma. It was the smell of memory. Nathan sat down on the old oak chair. Then he began to speak. His confession poured out like water from a broken dam. He spoke about how he had been manipulated, how Brianna had slowly isolated him from me. He cried, the tears of a man who suddenly realizes he almost destroyed the only foundation he truly had. I let him cry. Sometimes a structure becomes stronger only after it has been through fire. I handed him a towel and a bowl of hot stew. We did not talk about the $4.2 million. We did not talk about trusts or legal documents. Instead, we talked about the days when we used to fish together in the river behind the house. If this story has touched something real in you tonight, join this community by pressing the like button and subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment and tell me what this story made you feel. Nathan looked at me and asked quietly, Dad, why didn't you tell me about the money earlier? I placed my rough hand on his shoulder. Nathan, I said gently, if I had shown you the treasure before you knew how to protect the house, you would have lost both. The most valuable asset is not in the legal documents Miriam and I signed. It is not the $4.2 million. The real wealth is here, in this kitchen. In the moment when you understand who will still be standing beside you after everyone else has walked away. A man's value is not measured by what he owns. It is measured by what he is willing to protect. I looked at my son. The crack had been repaired, though the scar would always remain. But a repaired structure is often stronger than a brand new one because it has already survived its first test. Together we washed the dishes in the fading sunlight. The sound of plates and running water formed a quiet kind of music. The legacy of the Stokes family is not money. It is the presence of loved ones around the dinner table. That is the final blueprint I want to leave behind. A blueprint for forgiveness and resilience. The storm has passed, and the house is still standing. Not because it is expensive, but because its foundation was built on truth. After Brianna left with nothing, the house in Knoxville seemed to release a heavy, unnecessary load. But I knew an engineer's work does not end there. After removing a flawed structural element, the building must be reinforced immediately. I asked Nathan to come into my study. The room was filled with old technical drawings and the smell of aging paper. I pulled out a dark blue folder. It was time to show him the real framework of the Stokes family. I began explaining the concept of an irrevocable trust. My voice was calm, the same way I would instruct a young apprentice about pouring a foundation. You see, Nathan, once assets are placed here, they no longer belong to me or to you personally. They belong to the family. It becomes a separate legal entity. Brianna tried to attack you. But she never understood that you were only one component inside a system that had already been protected. I showed him the clauses Miriam and I had spent months designing. The black lines of legal language stood sharp against the white pages. The assets were meant for education for the next generation, for medical support, and for preserving integrity. Not a single dollar could be used for vanity spending or impulsive divorces. Nathan studied the numbers and the restrictions carefully. Slowly, he began to understand why I had chosen silence and discipline for 3 long years. I remember what Miriam told me, I continued. She said, "Walter, whoever ends up on the other side of this plan is not going to have a pleasant time." And I told her that was exactly the point. Not because I hated anyone, but because I loved this structure too much to watch it be destroyed by greed. Nathan ran his hand over the documents. I watched his shoulders relax. The tension he had carried for so long finally began to dissolve. He realized that I had never abandoned him. I had simply built a fortress he could return to when the storm arrived. A good engineer, I told him, does not build only for today. We build for 100 years from now. We calculate even the earthquakes that have not happened yet. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was the silence of agreement. Nathan looked at me, and for the first time in years his eyes were clear. "Dad," he said quietly, "I understand now why you still drive that old truck." I smiled. "That truck is not about being cheap," I said. "It is a statement about priorities." Then we began talking about the future, about how Nathan could learn to help manage the trust responsibly. I would teach him how to read not only engineering blueprints, but the blueprints of life itself. We were laying the first bricks of a new beginning, a structure that could not easily be broken. And this time it was not built from steel and concrete alone, but from trust and hard-learned lessons. He began speaking with a trembling voice. "Dad, I almost lost everything for an illusion." He admitted that he had been blinded by promises of a glamorous life. He had allowed Brianna to redraw the blueprint of his future. He had let her tear down the walls that once stood between father and son. I did not interrupt him. I listened the way an engineer listens to a machine running, carefully searching for the source of a fault. "Nathan," I finally said, "a structure can be damaged by storms or by poor maintenance. But if the foundation is still strong, we can always rebuild. You made mistakes, but you came back. That is what matters." I stood up and brought him another bowl of soup. The sight of the two of us sitting together at the table under the warm October sunlight was a moment I had waited 3 years to see. The $4.2 million still rested safely inside the trust. But tonight that number meant nothing. The most valuable asset is not hidden inside cold legal documents. It is here, in the warmth of this bowl of soup, in the presence of family at the dinner table, in the courage to admit mistakes and the strength to forgive. Those are the most durable materials in the world. Nathan stood up and helped me clean the kitchen. We washed the dishes together under the soft yellow light. The sound of running water and clinking plates created a quiet, peaceful rhythm. The legacy of the Stokes family is not the numbers in a bank account. It is resilience. It is integrity. And it is the ability to protect the people we love from the storms of greed. I looked out the window. Knoxville was glowing with evening lights. Tomorrow I would begin teaching Nathan how to read real blueprints. Not the plans for tall buildings, but the plans for a meaningful life. A life built on truth and loyalty. The structure of the Stokes family had survived its most severe load test, and now it stood stronger than ever. Tonight I could finally sleep well, because I knew my legacy had been placed in the right hands. Thank you for having the courage to stay with this story from Dad's real-life revenge. If you would like to continue, check the next story in the tab to the right. More dramatic stories are waiting for you there.